today we thought it'd be advantageous to talk about, what are some of the best practices to raise health tech seed capital. And so not a Series A, but your very first investment for your seed round. And Josh, you obviously have a lot of experience with this, or some experience with this, because you've done it. And so,
and of one, Alan.
Yeah, an N of one.
As you know, in healthcare, sample size really matters.
Yeah, exactly. So what we'll do is I will ask you these questions. We'll learn more about this, and then I'll have to go and interview some other health tech founders to really increase that sample size and make sure that we're giving out the actual best practices.
It's an idea for podcast number 2. You can branch off and do something else.
Exactly. And actually, if this episode is successful, I'd love to learn more about further capital stages. So looking at Series A funding, how does that work, and beyond there. I think it would be a great topic to cover. So for today's episode, though, let's focus on the seed capital. So raising seed capital for a health tech company, maybe you have an idea, maybe you want to start, bridging out and really building something great. And so how do we do that? How do we raise capital? I think maybe the first question, just to dive in, maybe you can add some color to some of the backstory on SeamlessMD and how you raise capital. But the question that I have is, what are the specific requirements, or what are the requirements to raise seed funding or seed capital for a health tech company?
Yeah, maybe Alan, I'll kind of back up and give a bird's eye view first before we dive into the details. And so for folks who are watching or listening, they might have different knowledge or experience when it comes to raising capital for a business. So maybe just to explain some of the lingo that we're using. Usually, if you're raising capital for the first time for a company, you might be raising only from individual angel investors, which are basically individuals, frankly, not an actual fund. So you might do an angel round, or if it's and usually I think an angel round usually is probably maybe less than $1 million usually. And then if you start raising, maybe 1 to 2 million, or even maybe $500,000, depending on semantics, that might be more of a seed round. And usually you'd raise that from individual angel investors or maybe investment funds that are dedicated to investing in seed rounds. And then if you start raising, several $1 million or more, then you get into that whole, and particularly if you're raising from what we call venture capital or institutional funds who professionally invest money in companies, private companies, that's when you start talking about, okay, Series A, B, C, D, et cetera. So what kind of Alan's talking about today is, okay, what about those, maybe your first round of funding in a company when it's still kind of the early stages for seed capital. So just laying that out there. And I think a good way to look at it is to think about, okay, how does an investor think about choosing companies to invest in? And when you're an investor, you really think about what are the risks to this company right now, and how much of that has been de-risked by different aspects of the company. And then that informs both the stage of the company you're investing in, as well as how likely to succeed. What does that actually mean? So I'll give you an example, Alan. So the things that they typically look for in a company are, okay, well, who's the team behind it? And what's the product, and how far along is it, and what's the market look like for this, and then what's been the traction or the progress that's been proven so far. And the more far along or successful or experienced each of those parts of a company are, the less risky the company is, the more successful it's been, and then probably the more likely you are to invest in the first place.
Right.
So when you're asking, okay, what requirements are there to raise seed capital, it's a mixture of how far along you are on those variables. And the better off you are on some of those variables, the worse you can be in others. Let me give you an example, right? So if you're someone who's never started a company before, never been successful in a business, for an investor to put seed capital in you, they're going to want to see more proof points in other parts of the company. So maybe that's a product that's further along. Maybe it's, your first handful of customers. Maybe certain metrics are really exciting. Whereas if, let's say you were a physician who's successfully started and sold 3 prior medical device companies or health tech companies, and all you have is an idea,
Right.
You will still find investors for that kind of person because they know you've done it before, and the investment is de-risked because of experience.
Mm.
But if you're someone like myself, when we raised our seed round back in 2015, Alan, where I've never started a health tech company before, we needed to show at least a handful of hospitals working with us, a couple of case studies showing how the product was being engaged with patients and some early clinical outcomes, and that we at least had a core team that was able to deliver on the product.
And I think also like your the core team that was able to deliver on the product, and especially with the founders, you did have somewhat of an unfair advantage where you had done a lot of work with readmissions and that was kind of your focus. And so having yourself as a position, and that's your background, that obviously helped with raising seed funding or at least giving investors confidence in who they'd be investing in.
Yeah, Alan, a big part of it is when they look at the team, like what's the story behind the team? And when I say story, I mean more about, as an investor, you think about, okay, well, why are you the team that is best suited to solve this problem?
Right.
So to your point, I think one of the things that was meaningful to investors was that, in my medical training, as you said, I did research on preventing readmissions back to hospital, and that was a kind of the problem space that Seamless started in terms of building technology to prevent readmissions. And so as an investor, that's actually a pretty good narrative. It's, hey, you have someone from the clinical world who was obsessed with this readmissions problem and is now trying to solve it. And Josh has teamed up with Willie and Phil, who bring kind of the more technical backgrounds to the company, and they have a genuine enthusiasm for healthcare. And by that point, we had demonstrated some early traction, and we had a product that was working on all these other things. So that gave early investors the confidence that, hey, you know what, this could be the right team for this problem.
Right. Just touching on, so you mentioned you had a product already that was serving some customers or serving some hospitals. Could you talk a little bit about how far along the product was at that point when you first went to raise seed capital?
Yeah, so I'll say two things, Alan. So we raised a small angel round of a couple of $1,000 when we first started the company, and within like basically less than a year within starting the company.
Right.
And at that time, that was more, I'll call it more of an angel round. At that time, we basically had like a prototype, and we had I think maybe at the time one, maybe two hospitals who had committed to using the product, but actually hadn't started using it yet because, as you can imagine, the first time you try to get a hospital using any new technology, it takes a lot longer.
Mm-hmm. And
And
actually, yeah.
Go ahead, Alan.
Well, I was gonna just talk about, you hear in the startup world a lot like a minimum viable product, and we've covered it in another episode where in healthcare it's a little bit different because there is patient safety concerns and there are these other risks involved. And so I know you've said before that a minimum sellable product is actually more the milestone that you need to hit. I might be kind of cutting you off mid-sentence and you were getting there, but could you talk a little bit about how that product is considered a minimum sellable product by that point? And
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about healthcare is, especially if you're talking about a product that touches patients and impacts, health outcomes and lives, the bar for quality that you need before you can put the product in the hands of patients is much higher than in any other industry. Probably outside of healthcare, consumer products have the lowest bar for quality expected, because and generally no one's going to die from using your product, and it's okay if it doesn't work that great. Next one up would be if you're selling to enterprises or businesses where, okay, like no one's going to die still, but then if you're touching a mission critical part of a company, it's got to work, pretty reliably. And then healthcare is like a notch above that, which has to be reliable, has to be secure, has to have, infrastructure for managing, patient data in a way that meets like HIPAA, PHIPAA, and all those guidelines. And it really can't screw up because it could affect the patient's life, especially for us when we were doing a lot of work in surgery, right? So the bar for us, as you said, was really high. And so number one, like it could take a lot longer to get a product to your first user in healthcare.
mm-hmm.
Because like to your point, it has to be not a minimal viable product or an MVP the way we hear in startup land. It has to be a minimal sellable or a product, if you will. So for us, it wasn't until a year after we, I guess, formally started the company that we had our first, hospital partner. And, over that time period, we had to get all, a lot of that security infrastructure started in place and a lot of testing done in terms of like patient use, not real patients, but, like people
Right.
use and reliability testing. But I would say in any other industry, you could probably spit up a prototype in, as quickly as you can build one.
Yep.
Not the case in healthcare. Yeah.
Right. And then how did you go about talking to the early users and really talking to the market to find out if this was a product market fit?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of it is just code outreach.
Right.
And by the way, that's also true when you're raising your seed capital.
Mhm.
It's unless you have a lot of people in your network or network of networks, you're actually going out and trying to get in front of people. So, I mean, I was a bit lucky that having been a product of my medical training, when we did our early customer discovery conversations, I was able to ask a lot of my mentors and colleagues to be part of interviews for us to understand the readmissions pain point and get
Right.
feedback on potential approaches with technology to solve that. And so I was lucky there, but I would say, a lot of it was just cold outreach. I mean, our very first hospital partner in Texas was a random email that I'd sent to someone who was at the time, the chief medical officer at the hospital or the department.
Right.
You know,
And
um,
and I think they had papers on readmissions or something as well. So it made sense that that's who you reached out to.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Right.
And so you just have to put in the work. I mean, even to be honest, even today, we're still having cold outreaches.
Yep.
That doesn't change.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say it sounds like, raising capital is pretty much like sales almost. It's kind of the same process. You'll have basically a pipeline of different stages where you're at. Maybe you've had a first meeting, maybe you're on a second meeting, and you're moving them along a pipeline, basically kind of similar to how you would run like a sales pipeline.
Yeah, and so the way I kind of joke about it, but I say joke, but actually it's real. When you're in a business, you're selling your product, whereas with investors, you're selling shares, which is a different kind of product, but you're selling shares in the company. And I think one of the differences that you notice in terms of what it means to raise capital from seed investors versus later stage investors or VCs is that as your company grows and then you raise capital from larger and larger funds and institutional investors later on is early on when you don't have as many proof points, you're really kind of getting people excited more about the vision, the potential of the company. Whereas in the later stages, it's more based on metrics
Right.
because, you can imagine, 10 or 15 years into a company, you have a lot more data, a lot more metrics, and it's more about how do we scale what we know is proven to work. Whereas early on, it's about, okay, do we think this team could convince hospitals to, buy this product? Do we think
Right.
this team could build a platform that can reduce readmissions and length of stay?
Right.
Those are the questions early on, and those change as the company gets more data and progresses.
I see. So when you're raising seed funding, does it make sense that you're raising the money with the knowledge that you're going to be raising money later on as well, or if you had to later on? Or I guess my question is, do you raise seed funding knowing that you're going to be raising another round later, or do you raise seed funding that should be enough to provide you the runway to take off to profitability? Or how do you view that, and how did you view that?
Yeah, every company is different, but I would say anytime you're raising capital, as part of your plan for that money that you work on with investors, you're determining, what milestones does this funding get us to, and so every company is different. But at the seed stage, especially in healthcare, when I would say it could take longer to develop certain things or get certain proof points, probably if you're in the healthcare space and you are working with hospitals and large health systems, probably at the seed stage, I guess most companies are using that funding to get to proving a combination of specific product milestones
Mhm.
and then also as well as certain sales or traction milestones. So
Right.
probably early on, if you're the seed stage, it's number one, can we build a product that actually we can prove through a couple of reference partner hospitals can actually achieve certain outcomes. So I think a common thing, let's say I were to redo Seamless again, and let's say we were to raise capital at the seed stage again, it'd probably be something like, hey, we want to raise the seed capital to advance the product enough and our playbook enough that we can actually reduce readmissions and demonstrate we can do that with maybe 3 different hospitals, and then prove that they're willing to pay for the product, basically.
Right.
Like that for healthcare and large hospitals, I think that would probably be a very common milestone with C capital. And then if you can prove that, then it would make sense to raise something like a Series A to say, hey, you know what, product works. We've shown that a handful of large hospitals are seeing value in using and buying this. Now can we prove that we can actually build a business around it? And hey, if those hospitals pay you enough money that you don't have to raise more money, and you can just start building a sales and marketing team and a customer success team and grow your engineering team, then maybe you don't have to raise money. But I would say probably for most healthcare companies, those hospitals, early hospital partners, are not paying them so much that they don't need to get more resources to grow. So most likely you will need to raise more money to grow early on.
Right. That makes sense. And then is there like an ideal dollar amount that you're looking for in a seed funding round? And maybe it's, to your point, enough money to get the sales engine working, to get the product to hit those milestones.
Yeah, every company is different, Alan, and it comes down to whatever the next major milestones are for the company. So if you look at the landscape today, what is a seed round has definitely evolved in terms of size. So it's not crazy that a seed round could be as low as, $1 or $2 million in some places. I've seen seed rounds, quote unquote seed rounds, that are more than $10 million because maybe there's major technical milestones they have to achieve, or maybe the founder is like a serial entrepreneur with a lot of success who's able to justify a much larger seed round earlier on. So there's no set number. It comes down to like every business is different and what makes sense for the business to reach that next major milestone. I mean, if you look at one end of the spectrum, like pharma companies need a lot more capital early on because of how intensive that research and development process is for a drug. So it's not one size fits all by any means.
Another thing that, Josh, you've said this to me before, where you'd prefer to raise money, or you tell me, raise money when you can, not when you need to. Could you explain what that means and how you came to that?
Yeah. You kind of want to raise money when you have momentum and when you don't have to have it. So that way you have the option of not relying on capital if, for example, maybe the terms being offered are not, really that good for the company, or could put the company in trouble later, right? And so you wanna raise when it's favorable for the company to do so generally. And then you have options. It's like, hey, you know what? If they're bad terms, we don't have to take the capital. We'll just keep doing what we're doing, and maybe at some point in the future it'll make more sense to raise, and we get more reasonable terms from investors.
Right.
Whereas what you don't want to do, and again, not saying that it'll never happen because it could happen, but what you don't want to do is be in a situation where you have 3 months of runway left in the company, and if you don't raise capital, you're going to be out of business.
Right.
And because of that, your company is higher risk, and investors may ask for a large chunk of the company, or a bunch of terms that would really not be that reasonable or favorable. But because you're running out of money, you might have to take them to keep the business going. So ideally, you're not raising money in those situations, although that might happen, and that's just life. That could happen, but it wouldn't be your preference to.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a story. I might be getting this entirely wrong, but Jeff Bezos had to gamble his last amount of money that they had for Amazon, like back when it started. I think they were maybe like 3 years into the company or something. He had to like go to a casino to finally get enough money, and then he actually did, or something like that.
Wow, I did not know that.
You don't know that one? Yeah.
The only one I know is like the Elon Musk story where I forget what year it was, but he basically took half of his net worth and put it into SpaceX, and the other half and put it into Tesla.
Yeah.
And at that time, like they both needed the money, or else they were going to go out of business. And so he basically bet his entire net worth on both of them.
Himself, yeah. Wow.
and so far it's worked out for him. So
Right.
great
Right.
story about that, apparently.
Yeah. In terms of terms for the actual capital, is there a specific type of capital that's best, or, and I know it's probably case by case, but yeah, I've heard things like convertible debts, for instance, or different future like options for equity. Is there a particular type of capital that seed funders or angel investors tend to lean towards?
Yeah, so there's two main types of they call them instruments for raising capital. Basically, the two that you mentioned. One is what we call an equity investment or equity financing, and that's actually the kind of thing that you see on Shark Tank, which is,
Mhm.
hey, I'll invest $100,000 for 10% of your company, and then that means your company will be valued at $1 million after the investment. Um, that's the form that we used, right? And the pros of that are it's very clear to everyone what the investor's ownership is. They know exactly how many shares they have. They know what percentage of the company they own at the time of the investment. It's very clean that way. The cons are that there's a lot more paperwork. There's more legal costs associated with all that paperwork. And so it's that, okay, it takes a bit longer, it's a bit more costly, but it's very clear, right?
Right.
Convertible debt is basically another instrument where um, you basically sign documents that say, hey, you know what, Alan, the investors are going to loan you the money. And at some point in the next few years, you have to start paying back, the interest and eventually the loan. But if the company raises an equity investment round in the next X years, this convertible debt will actually just convert into shares in
Oh,
the
interesting.
company at a later
Interesting.
at that time in the future. The reason why people do that is it's a lot less paperwork because it's a loan, not actually buying shares yet, and so the legal costs are lower. It's faster. You can defer a lot of those business terms, investment terms, to whatever happens in the next round of investment financing. And so for some companies, that's been something that's been preferred. But again, like then there's a lot less is clear at the time about what the
Right.
investment's worth. But both are kind of common options.
Hmm. And then in terms of those initial meetings that you have with these investors, like, are there specific documents that you had prepared for Seamless and/or you recommend people prepare?
Yeah, so I mean, most people will have some version of an investment deck or a pitch deck, and basically, you're typically covering things such as, what is the problem you're trying to solve, how are you solving it, what's the market that you're targeting, what's been your traction so far in terms of either users, revenue, or other milestones that are relevant to the company's progress. How big could the market be? Competitors, major risks in the company, how you're solving them, your
Right.
business model, how are you actually selling the product in terms of both the revenue model, but also how are you getting this to in front of customers,
Right.
your team, um, and then kind of what you're raising and what your plan is. And I mean, I think generally people would say if you can somehow condense this into like 10 slides, that's amazing. I would say generally it's hard to do that, and usually you're gonna have either closer to 15 to 20 slides, especially in healthcare where there's a lot of complexity,
Right.
and a lot of appendix slides. Um, and usually, like, you're using those slides as a guide to pitching the story. And I think that's a really important part of
Hmm.
the investment aspect. It's how great of a story and a narrative can you tell the investor. And I think the reason why it's important to be good at storytelling is, at least the way I look at it, is if I'm an investor, if this person can't even sell me on the story,
Right.
how confident can I be that they can sell a customer on the story?
Hmm.
So that's one thing that I would think about, and why people go, well, why is it so important that you can tell a great story, or
Hmm.
be a good salesperson? It's because, well, how's the investor going to be confident that, unless your numbers are out of the world, which you probably won't have as many numbers at the seed stage.
Right.
So at that point, you have to somehow convince them that, hey, you know what, like, we will get the numbers because we can sell this.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think also just it's so intrinsic to humans to understand certain things through story, and to be almost taken on the journey of like, what is the vision? Okay, what's the problem? How big is the market? Like, what are we actually solving? How do we go about it? And telling the story about who you are, and expressing it through that pitch makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, I just another comment at the seed stage. People ask about, well, what do investors actually look for? And the truth is that the earlier stage you're at, what investors look for will vary. But I think the important thing is, because there's so much that's unproven, a critical thing is, do they have some sort of emotional attachment to the company
mm,
that gets them excited about the company,
mhm,
and they almost want to help you make this a reality.
right,
And so, for example, a lot of people who invested early in Seamless were, angel investors who just really wanted to make healthcare better in some way. Maybe they had a personal connection to it. Maybe they've had a surgery before, or maybe they are highly involved in healthcare in the community. But they had a genuine, excitement for,
attachment. Yeah,
okay, yeah, I would love for Seamless to be successful and exist. Like it would be rewarding for me, even beyond the financial aspect. Like it'd be
right.
meaningful to me later on. Like if you're raising a series DEF where you're talking to just professional investors who really just want to look at metrics and
Yeah,
are looking at just purely, okay, how are we going to make money in the next 3 years if this company gets bought or it goes public? That's a different mindset than early stage investors.
right.
And so like, I almost kind of look at it as, it's no different than selling product to customers, where you can tell in that first meeting. Alan, you've done sales, so you know this. You can tell in that first meeting, is the investor or the buyer of a product, are they looking for reasons to say yes
Mhm,
or for reasons to say no?
right.
And the people who tend to buy products or invest in your company are the ones who are genuinely looking for reasons to say yes.
Yeah.
The ones who you can tell right away are like, they're just finding reasons to get out of this, or like to
Hmm.
find reasons to find flaws in it. They almost never invest because they're talking themselves out of it.
Right.
So there has to be that co-investor company fit.
Right. Absolutely. Um, a question that I have: if you were to go and start another company and raise seed funding again, or differently, is there anything that you would change this time, or like any lessons that you've learned from now building this company to the point where we have a Series A, and it's well on the way? Um, would you change anything if you went back and raised a new round for seed funding?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking back, I mean, because we were first time founders, you don't really, you have a lot of assumptions about, okay, what's it really going to take to achieve this next milestone around developing the product
Yeah.
or acquiring customers or proof points. And so I think for me now, it would be more about, I have a much better sense of, okay, like, what do we really have to do in the next let's say 18-24 months to get to that next milestone, and how much would that really cost. So I think I have a much better sense of what it would take to get there, and I'll have a lot more of an accurate kind of roadmap for investors.
Right.
I mean, the other thing too, Alan, is that if we were to do this again, right? Like, you and I, everyone else has so much more experience now. So, I mean, you could argue that we could actually achieve some of these milestones faster.
Yeah.
We've built up some social credibility in the space. We could probably find early adopters faster.
Hmm.
So there's some things that we could actually just frankly do much more efficiently.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think we would probably have planned it. We have a clear roadmap, I guess, is probably one
Right.
thing.
Yeah. Sorry, my brain is kind of working backwards today, but your earlier point that you made about investors, especially in the seed round, focusing more on their excitement towards the product and the idea, and solving the problem, and really being attached to that outcome, as opposed to just metrics for more later stage companies. Um, I had a thought also. It's probably even amplified in health tech or in healthcare, because there is that social impact component as well. So it's not just a business where, hey, let's make a lot of money. Like, can you show me how we're going to make money, and do that? There is a social component to it as well, which I think is different than other industries necessarily compared to healthcare.
And it's true, Alan. And it's one of those things where, as an individual and as an individual investor, you end up deciding how much weight you put on different values. So I'll be honest, right? Like if you were someone and you were thinking about, okay, I just wanted to get the job that made me the most possible money in the world, given what my skills and talents are. There's probably jobs out there that you would hate, and this is true probably for everyone in the world, that you would just absolutely hate. You would hate the work, you would hate the culture of the people you work with, but you could make a lot more money than you do right now, for example, right? But I think most people don't only use financial ROI as a consideration for where they work, right? They care about things like culture, right? They care about the type of work that they're doing, growth opportunities, all these things. And so you might trade off financial upside for, like, culture and happiness and purpose, right? And I think the same is true for investors, where, yeah, I could probably maybe I could have made more money just going to this like really hot, fintech startup, but I really don't care about fintech. Right. You could still do that, but I think a lot of people would actually want to invest in things that they find genuinely exciting. The other thing too is then, as you track along the company in the future, you just frankly will probably care more about it. You'll be more engaged. It's more fun, frankly, probably for the investor to genuinely care about the mission of the company.
Yeah, I'm curious. What was the percentage of angel investors or investors you were talking with who had a background in healthcare or had an interest in healthcare or had invested in healthcare before? I imagine it's probably a high percentage.
Yeah, I have to check. I mean, I would say probably at least half.
Yeah,
probably more, maybe closer to 3/4. I mean, in the seed round, at least, maybe about at least half had some sort of either healthcare background or related experiences. I mean, now that we've done our Series A, it's much higher than that, because we brought a lot more healthcare focused investors in the company. But even the seed round, I mean, at least half, maybe closer to 3/4, that I have to check, have some relationship to healthcare. But I would say everyone who invested really cared about the mission of the company. That was probably something very common, and I think it's true for our team, Alan. Like, frankly, everyone here is so talented, they could work somewhere else, but people often come here and stay here because of the impact on patients.
If a potential investor in a seed round was offering you money, is there any reason for you not to take their investment?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing that we have to think about is that, when you raise money from investors have different levels of engagement. So there are certain investors who are very hands off. So they would say, "Hey, Alan, I want to invest in the company, but I'll be honest, like, I can't really add much value, and I don't have the time. Maybe if I could, I don't have the time to be that engaged, but I want to support the company. I'm excited about the team and the company, and what, like, let's be a part of this, right?" And then there's others who, if they invest in a company, they'd rather invest in fewer companies but be more engaged, right? And so sometimes some of the larger investors in a company might maybe want a board seat or be a board observer, or just like have more regular conversations with the founders to try and be helpful. I think the thing that I've come to realize, and I've reflected on this both being on the side as the entrepreneur, but also if there's other companies like and friends that I help on the side, right? I think a lot now about, okay, well, what actually is going to be the most valuable thing for the company? Because if you're an investor, you have to think about what's best for the company, not what's best for me, right? And as employees, we think about that the same. I would hope we think about the same way too in the company. What's best for Seamless, right? And if I'm an investor who's trying to get on, let's say Alan's the entrepreneur, I'm trying to get in Alan's ear all the time, right? And then if you amplify that by 10, 20, 30 investors, how much time does Alan actually have to actually work on the business, right? And so I think what I've realized is that sometimes it doesn't matter who you raise capital from. If you're concerned about that person could, I'll call it, detract from the company in some way beyond capital. So it's great if someone is an investor who is able to add a lot of value because of their experience or their connections or whatnot. If they're an investor who just doesn't want to be that engaged, but at least that way they won't harm the business, that's generally okay too. And like, we're always happy to have more passive supporters, because still like the capital and then the random serendipitous stuff that they do is really valuable. But if it's an investor who detracts from the company because they're maybe distracting the CEO by, let's say, like, asking him to do things that really don't help the company, or bombarding him with like ideas that, like, you don't have time to explore every idea, right?
Right.
that could be something that doesn't seem like a big deal when you're raising capital, but could become a big deal after you raise, because now you feel an obligation to satisfy the expectations of an investor, right? And
Right.
if you multiply that by many investors, and if everyone was like that, that could be unwieldy, and it could actually decrease the value of the investment because you're distracting the CEO from actually working on the business sometimes.
Right. Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, the last question I had, are you able to talk a little bit about the value of maybe like startup incubators and some of the networking opportunities that you get from like a Next 36, for instance?
Yeah, so I mean, we did Next 36, as you mentioned. YC is a popular one, Techstars, all that kind of stuff. When I think about the value of one of these incubators or accelerators, I think most of the value comes from the people. So a mixture of both who are the mentors in the network, and that matters more to me than any sort of curriculum or events or anything else they put on, because all those events and curriculum and workshops are going to go away after the accelerator. But what actually stays is the quality of the network and the alumni network too. So if the mentors there are really, really great and experienced and have a huge network themselves, that puts you in touch with potential future investors, basically customers, partners, mentors, right? So whenever people ask me, hey, Josh, is this a good accelerator incubator? I say, hey, look at the list of people involved in it, the mentors, the supporters. And those are the people that you're basically hoping to get access to.
Right.
Those people potentially really help the business based on their backgrounds. If the answer is, a resounding yes, then that might be a good option. But if you look at the list and you're like, actually, they're not really that relevant to my business, then
maybe not the best option.
May not be the best one. Yeah.
Right. That's great. So from here, Josh, let's say I have an idea. Where do I start? Do I start Googling seed capital funders in my area near me on Google, or where would you start if you had to start all over?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so for me, the most important thing is, first of all, like, operate as if you're not going to have funding, because the thing that would impress an investor most is actually progress, right? So if I'm an investor, I care a lot about, okay, like, what has a team accomplished together? And if you're able to show me the first time we meet that, hey, like, we're continuing to push, like, we have a high velocity of output, whether that's booking meetings, building the product, whatever it is, that's what's exciting. And also that means that you're not relying on the investors to make this work, right? So number one, like actually deliver great output inside the small team. And then two is, I would say the two main ways to find seed investors are, one is like work your network. Like if you were you, Alan, you'd ask me, right? Like work your network, right? And then two is I would look up similar startups to yours and who they raise seed funding from, and I would reach out to those people.
Right.
And people often give this advice that, hey, you should never do cold outreach to investors. Always try to find someone to do a warm introduction. A bunch of our investors I met just by reaching out cold. And same as in sales, you reach out cold, and sometimes people say yes. So definitely we shouldn't knock cold outreach to investors either. Great if you can get an introduction, definitely do that, but don't feel like you have to be privileged with a network. I mean, great if you are, but a lot of us aren't. And then for a lot of us, we have to put in the work to meet people. So
that's awesome. For anyone else listening, do you have any final messages on seed funding or?
No, I think the only thing I'd say is to the 6 million listeners out there.
It grows every week.
I'm just picking a number out of the air, Alan. I definitely felt like I got very theoretical on some of these topics, and so if anyone's listening and had some follow-up questions, where whether it's scenarios or specific detailed parts of these topics that you'd want us to get into with more practical specifics, definitely send them our way. Would love to dive into those as well. Or maybe at some point we should have a podcast where we get companies to kind of do really early stage pitches, and we can actually
that'd be cool. Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know.
That might be pitches, and then later stage companies sharing stories of how they did it.
Absolutely.
Sure. So over to the audience, let us know you have any more questions on it, or if you'd like to hear that kind of an episode with different pitches and
I mean, where else
a
can
good
you
sense.
get immediately onto a distribution to 6 million listeners and growing?
Awesome. Well, Josh, looking at the time, we should probably wrap it up here. Again, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate the conversation, and looking forward to the next one. See you, Alan.
See ya.